Well, thank you very much, Dominique, for introducing me. This is joint work with Darek Biernacki, Maciek Pirug, and Piotrek Polesiuk down in the University of Wrocław in Poland. And it's part of our ongoing work on algebraic effects and handlers and languages that use them and how to reason about programs in such languages. So, well, just to start, let's begin with a quick crash course on algebraic effects and handlers. So the idea is to have a language in which you can write effectful code in new and interesting ways. So we start with a simple effect, reader, which behaves intuitively like a reader monad in Haskell, in that it has one operation, ask, which means that you can ask the environment to provide you a value of type A. And how do we use it? Well, we have a code here that uses ask twice. And it says ask plus 2, and then it handles this request to the environment. This is the environment. The handler is the environment, by saying, well, whenever someone asks me, resume the computation in the place where you asked for the value with the value 20. So the idea is that we'll start evaluating. We'll hit the first ask. So the handler forms an evaluation context. We hit the first ask. We move the control into the handler. The handler says resume with a value 20. Now we're in a position where we have 20 plus ask plus 2, hit the second ask, get another 20, and reduce in the end to 42. Now, of course, this is a rather boring example, and this is not everything that we can do with these algebraic effects and handlers. In particular, we're not bound to resume. Like we can write a code like that. And here, when we first move control from the code under the handler to the handler, it will just say, OK, the value is 20. So in the end, this piece of code behaves much more like a handler for an exception than a handler for, well, asking the environment for a value. So we can also do stuff like that. We can resume multiple times. We generally have access to the resumption as a value, which gives us the full power of programming with continuations. Now, why is this talk in the types and effects and type and effect systems session? Well, because these are usually coupled with type and effect systems, these sorts of languages. In particular, here we have a simple piece of code that tries to ask the environment for a value and divide it by n, but of course it doesn't make sense if n is 0. Right? So what should we do if n is 0? Well, we invoke another algebraic effect to raise an error. So what sort of type could we assign to this piece of code? Well, simply, it will be an integer if it's an integer division, and it's a reader int, right? Because we're asking for a value of type int of the environment, and it might also raise an error. So this brings us to one of the mainstay things about algebraic effects. It's very easy to combine different sorts of effects. Like if we were using monads in Haskell, one of these effects would have to be a monad transformer, and we'd have to go through all the hoops that are associated with this. So this is the general setting in which we will work. And just an executive summary of what algebraic effects and handlers give us. Well, the idea is as follows. The operations don't have any predefined meaning. We have seen that in the previous slide, where the same code had very different meaning depending on the handler. The ask itself is just a token. It's just a notion of who to ask for the interpretation. And then the interpretation is provided by the handlers stuck in the evaluation context. So this is, again, an important feature of algebraic effects. The evaluation context matter very much because it's into the evaluation context that we're passing the control. We're capturing bits of evaluation context that gives us delimited continuations, sorts of power. And again, these are often coupled with type and effect systems. And this is the important bit, because in these type and effect systems, we can often say whether a computation is pure. And this means that the pure computations are actually pure or behave as if they were pure. In particular, it gives us good reasoning principles. It allows us to do away with things like value restriction, because purity restriction, a more semantic notion, is expressible and much nicer in this sort of setting. And it's very easy to combine diverse effects, as we've seen in the previous slide. So in effect, what this gives us, from one perspective at least, it's the limited continuations, but the limited continuations made modular. And this is the important aspect, because usually when we think of the limited continuations in terms of, say, shift and reset control operators, these are very, very difficult to program with. Algebraic effects, in contrast, are reasonably nice. So, is it all a brilliant rose garden with no problems? Well, of course not, right? So one of the problems is, let's take our code snippet from before and wrap it in another handler for ask. And then let's consider what is the intended result of this piece of code. And, well, at first glance, it might say, well, of course, we just compute the inner bit, and then, well, there's no ask after we compute to 42, so the result should just be 42. But it's not so simple, really. In reality, these asks, either of these asks could be meant to interface with either of the handlers. So we'd have like 4 distinct choices here. And of course, this is a completely artificial example, but it really comes up in practice. It really comes up in practice, particularly if we want to write modular library code that actually uses effects. You basically reduce to something like that, to code that looks a little bit like that, if you are using library code. So, I mean, you'd have to take me on my word here. It really does matter. It really is a problem in practice. It really is a problem that everyone who wants to give a programming language with algebraic effects has to handle at some point, and they do. So what can we do? Well, the first and the simplest answer is, let's just pretend the problem is not there. Let's just say, okay, you always match the closest enclosing handler, and everything should be fine. And you can do that, and you can do that in a type-safe way. And this is what a extension of links to algebraic effects by Daniel Hillestrom and Sam Lindley does. But there's problems. In particular, it leads to leaky abstractions in some higher-order functions, particularly effect polymorphic functions. It generally does not scale all that well. You want to be able to express these sorts of patterns where the asks are intended to match different handlers. So what else can we do? Well, an earlier iteration of the F programming language, due to Mattia Pletner and his collaborators, introduced dynamically allocated instances. So you could establish an instance and then say at each ask which instance of the effect is it supposed to be. But these instances were very powerful. In particular, you could compute at which instance you want to do an effect in a basically unconstrained way. And this removed a lot of the benefits of the type and effect systems. In particular, it made it very hard to establish that a particular piece of code was pure. So it was scrapped in the end. I think F currently does not provide that sorts of instances. And some of the languages based on row polymorphism and row polymorphic type and effect systems, like Dan Lyons Coca and Frank, due to Lucas Convent and Sam Lindley and Conor McBride and Craig McLaughlin, and also our prior work, allows us to insert coercions into code. So basically, we'd be able to enclose one of these instances, or both, with some of ask with some coercions that would say, basically, both statically and at runtime, they would influence which handler would get matched with which ask. Now, this allowed us a lot of power, right? These are called coercions in our prior work and adapters by the Frank authors. This allows us a lot of power, but you don't really want to program with coercions. And since we have 4 possible implementations that we might want to like that could be intended in this particular case, you can't, in general, infer coercions and insert them into the places where you'd want them. So it's a problem. It's a real problem. And what we tried to do to solve it was we looked at what these coercions and adapters actually allowed us to do. And it turns out that they were very, very similar to the structural rules of intuitionistic logic, of all things, only operating on the effects that describe the evaluation context rather than the usual context of variables. So, well, if the three main coercions that we had corresponded to three structural rules of intuitionistic logic, the obvious thing to go, the obvious place to go to was, well, why not use variables? These are nice. We tend to use them in everyday life, right? And this is what we did. So the idea is that we annotated the operations ask with so-called instance variables. And then the idea is that handlers also are annotated with the instance variables, but handlers bind them much like lambdas do with usual variables, right? So in this case, it's clear to see that the first ask matches the outermost handler, and the second ask matches the innermost handler, and we can easily express all four combinations just by annotating appropriately. So this is, of course, a completely distinct sort of variables. They do not represent values. They can only be substituted for other instance variables. There's nothing else. There's no instance values as such in the language. There's only variables all the way down. And as usual in these cases, when you want to introduce this sorts of variables, in the end you also want to abstract over them. So we have to add another new construct, an instance lambda, so to say, which can bind instance variables much like a lambda rather than like a handler. So there's two different instances of binding and just one simple instance of use of these instance variables only on operations and passed as arguments to instance lambdas. So how does this work in practice? How does the type system look? Well, the judgment looks something like this. And of course, the gamma and the E and the at least notions of tau and epsilon are quite clear. We have a variable context, we have an expression, we have a type and an effect. Now, what are the other things, and what can we do with types and effects? First off, the delta is just a simple system F-like context of type variables, which we note here in blue, and these map type variables to kinds, mostly because we want to be able to quantify both over types and effects and other stuff possibly. So the second context, and this one is the interesting one, this is what tells us what instance variables we can use. And this maps instance variables to signatures. Okay? And so signatures is basically the reader and state and stuff that we used there. And effects, finally, after all the years of row-like systems, behave like finite sets of instances. Like in old systems of Talpin and Jouvelot, it's just a finite set, and we can use both alphas and a's there. And for types, we have arrows annotated with effects, we have universal quantification, and we have quantification over instance variables. And this means that the instance variables behave a lot like indices in dependent ML. Only they are not natural numbers, they are just variables. And signatures basically encode the signatures like reader. So how can we compute with these? We can compute in two ways. First off, we can reduce under the binders, under the handlers, which bind the instance variables, which is elegant and conceptually simple, but it's very hard to implement, and the reductions can make instance variables globally free. In particular, if V here uses A in some way, it escapes its scope. So this is one way. The other way is to generate fresh runtime instances and introduce actual values, or values, not really values, but runtime instances whenever we see a new handler. And then the handler reduction becomes standard, like what we've seen before. And the pros here are, it's easy to implement, it's robust, it's very reminiscent of region calculi. However, it's very, very unclear whether it's correct. Because the context may include multiple handlers for the same label, because you can reproduce context using the continuation that you capture. So the question is, are the two semantics distinct or equivalent? And the thing is, in general, they are distinct. So if we reduce under the binders, the code that we see here actually gets stuck, because the inner do escapes, the inner B escapes its scope, and when we reintroduce it into the scope, we have to rename the binder from B to C, like you usually do with hygienic convention. On the other hand, if we introduce labels, the whole thing reduces normally, and even though L2 is outside of the handler, these are no longer scoped, so it reduces to a value. So this means that any equivalence that we might have would require us to rely on types, which means it would be definitely non-trivial. And in particular, if the starting term is well typed, then this means that the open semantics, the first semantics, is wrong or not sound. And yeah, so this might be the case, actually. What about a monomorphic type system where we don't have polymorphic signatures? And it turns out that in this case, because of the types, it is actually the two semantics are equivalent. And this forms our main technical result, which we prove by a very complex logical relation. So I'll leave you with this slide. So what's in the paper? A novel type system, two semantics, two logical relations, one for establishing parametricity for the generative semantics, and one for establishing equivalence of the two. And it's all formalized in Coq. We have an experimental implementation, and I'll be happy to take questions.
So let me open the floor to questions. I don't see anything on the slide, so I don't know if there's anyone in the audience. Someone is pointing there.
I know that Racket has, I know that Racket has delimited continuations with labels that you can continue from a particular label. How does this compare to that?
So I'm not entirely certain what labels are there in Racket. There is prior work on multi-prompt delimited continuations, which I think is what Racket has. It's related, but it's not quite that. Like the Racket, okay, like delimited multi-prompt continuations generally are not lexically scoped. They are dynamic labels, basically, to which you can jump.
So this is very nice. People have been dealing with these problems for a long time, and these coercions were a bit hard to work with. So it's very nice that you look and go, oh wait, it's just variables. That seems like quite a nice step. One wonders why it took us so long to get here, but it's nice that we finally got here. Two very different questions. You're now doing things with lexical binding, which makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
But we've sometimes used dynamic binding for things like exceptions. So one question is, have you thought at all about how you might mix lexical and dynamic? Is that a good idea? And the other question is, you gave some good theoretical reason for believing this is a good way to go. Have you done a practical test, like just coding up a lot of stuff this way and seeing if it works? How many of the examples in the literature can be handled by this approach?
So, I mean, we didn't do extensive tests. We've we've ported most of our prior examples from when we had coercions into this system, and a lot of it is actually much nicer. Particularly, like there's an issue, right? You might want to say, well, of course, it's nice to be able to distinguish these two instances of the same effect. But what if I only ever use one? I wouldn't want to decorate everything with variables if it's just if it doesn't serve any purpose. And so this is one direction of future work that we'd like to consider. Our experimental implementation actually does something there, but we're not entirely sure how well founded this is. So if we have this, then the code becomes really quite cleaner with respect to the prior stuff. Although, for instance, we can't encode one of the examples from our paper 2 years back, which just depended way too strongly on dynamic binding of these effects.
Right, and when I read your paper, it points out which example is hard to do?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so time is up for questions. I'm sorry, there are still questions.
Sure.
You have to ask.
I mean, I'm around. I'd be happy to talk about this, so yeah.